Hey everybody, Max Mick here, and today I'm going to be bringing you a sealed guide for Kaldheim Limited. Recently it was announced that there is going to be the first ever limited arena open coming to arena not this weekend, but the next weekend, weekend of February the 20th, and it's going to be primarily sealed. In addition, this Friday, I believe if you are a PTQ grinder like I am, on Magic Online, there is a sealed PTQ, and then the weekend of the arena open, the 20th, again, there's going to be two PTQs both on Saturday and Sunday. So there's a lot of good sealed events coming up, and I really wanted to share with you guys some of the sealed knowledge that I've garnered over my time in the format. I recently wrote an article on Draft Sim about drafting the format, and while I do think it's a very good article and describes pretty well how you should draft the format, it does not talk about sealed. And I do think that sealed has a good amount of differences from draft, so I wanted to make a separate video. However, I am going to reference that article some amount, and I also think it's just a good guide for draft, which is a fun format and something that you should know about. So go ahead and check that out. I'll put the link in the description. Check that out if you haven't already. And finally, I do talk pretty fast, so I'm going to put a link to the Google Docs that I used as an outline for this video so that people who cannot understand how I talk can read instead, or use it as subtitles in case YouTube fucks up the subtitles. So with all that out of the way, let's get straight into it. How does this sealed format play out? So I tried to have everything be coherent and tie in with each other. So first I want to start off with the format speed. If you read the article, you know this already, but if not, I think the draft format is very, very slow. And if you've played draft and sealed formats before, you may know that sealed formats are typically slower than draft, and that's because your card pool is, you have less control over your card pool, so trying to build an aggressive deck with a coherent game plan is more difficult. And so with Kaldheim's draft format already being very slow, I will get into the reasons why, you can imagine that the sealed format would be even slower. Speaking of, the main reasons that I think it's slow are the two main mechanics. Foretell, as you can see on some of the cards here, and Snow, which you can't, but I'm sure you know what a Snow card is. If not, go read the spoilers. And the reasons for this are that the Snow cards are in blue and green. And because the Snow cards are such better rate cards than in other colors, I wanted to look at some cards for that. Oh, I wanted to look at a deck for this. I wanted to look at some cards, but maybe a deck. But it's just because the Snow cards are such better rate cards than the other cards in the format. I meant to pull cards up, but it looks like I didn't prepare enough. Cards like Bergstrider or the 2/2 Elf that untaps Snowlands. Like, if you just ignore the fact that they need Snow permanents to work, they're better rate cards than most of the cards in the set, right? So the issue is the Snow payoffs. But because they're better rate, it makes blue and green better colors. And as it so happens, in general, in Magic, blue and green are the slower colors that do not attack as well or be as aggressive as normal. So Snow kind of explains why the format is slower. The other primary reason, which I think is more important, is Foretell, which I just talked about. And I go much more into depth on my thought process and the logic behind why Foretell slows the format down. But the short version of it is that I want to pull up an example of some sort. Let's say you have a Soros Packmate, right? The short version of it is that you can use this card to replace your 2 and 3 drops. Normally, you'd have to put 2 and 3 drops in your deck to not die to aggro decks, right? Otherwise, you just won't play cards on turn 2 and 3, will get very far behind on board and lose the game. But if you draw those 2 and 3 drops later, they're not nearly as good, and then suddenly you're just at parity with your aggressive opponent in the late game because you still had to play the same 2 and 3 drops they did. It's just they're an aggressive deck and you're not. With cards like Soros Packmate and other Foretell cards that provide you tempo, you can foretell them on turn 2, and they gain you tempo. Not immediate tempo, but eventually you'll realize that tempo when you cast the spell, and then you'll be up like +1 card, and perhaps I chose a bad example, but you'll be up 1 card because you played a foretold card, and you'll also have not lost tempo. So just for an example, I'm gonna just for an example, let's pull something up. For example, let's say your opponent plays some generic 2-drop. We'll just say a 2-mana 2/2 and then a 3-mana 3/3. Obviously, they'll play something more powerful than that because it's a new set with lots more powerful cards. But in that example, and then your turn 2 and your turn 3 is foretell Dwarven Reinforcements, play Dwarven Reinforcements, right? So now they've played 2 cards and you've played 1. You've wasted 1 mana, and they wasted 0, to be fair, but you're up a card, right? Because you've played 1 card that kind of compares with their 2. I wish I had a better example off of hand, but I guess I didn't prepare enough for this. Hopefully what I'm saying makes sense, that as you replace your curve pieces with foretell cards, you are gaining value without losing tempo. you might take a little bit of damage, right? Because on that turn 2 that you foretold this card, your opponent attacked you with their 2/2, right? But as soon as you play the card and realize the tempo, suddenly the 2/2 is not relevant anymore. So you basically pay 2 life for +1 card. And now this is a very exaggerated analogy or example or whatever you want to call it, but I think it's indicative of how Foretell plays out and why it slows the format down. So it basically allows control decks to be much better in the late game without losing equity against aggro decks. And if you've played the draft format or the sealed format, you'll see that play out firsthand. It increases consistency, which it increases the consistency of control decks, but not of aggro decks, because aggro decks don't want to put these cards in their deck, right? Because if they foretell this on turn 2, well, then they're losing damage. Then it could attack you on turn 3 with the creature that they just played. And if they don't attack you, well, then how are they going to kill you? Because they're an aggro deck. They're trying to win the early game, not the late game. So when you combine both of the effects of both Foretell and of Snow on the format, you get what amounts to be a pretty slow format. And then when you apply that to Sealed, it gets even slower because there's a bunch of fixing and bombs that you want to splash and tap lands, and you can't have a consistent aggro deck, and so on and so forth. Now, I want to move into what can you do with this, right? I just gave you some information. Sealed is slow. Great. You don't know what to do with that, or maybe you do, but I want to talk about it more in depth anyway. So what should you do with this information? I'm going to provide you with a pretty comprehensive draft strategy. So if you're just looking for me to tell you, do this, and then play your deck out and try and play the best you can, this is the section for you. So pay attention during this next 10 minutes or however long it takes. I essentially tried to compress my very complex strategy for building sealed decks into something that has a set number of steps that you can follow and end up with a deck that's about as good as your pool could have. So my first step is to look for the greediest possible deck you can build. And now I think we're going to move on to here. So a deck like this, or you can feel free to pause and look at the deck more if you want. I won't scroll too fast. A deck like this, or a deck like this. Something that's just a lot of colors, very good at winning the late game, very powerful cards, making use of your fixing that you possibly have and of your bombs, right? And this doesn't necessarily have to be blue or green, but more often than not, it's blue or green. And typically, it tries to win a late game either with card advantage and removal, bombs, which is the most likely explanation given that the set has a bunch of bombs and is also sealed, so you get 6 rares, or very big creatures. Like this deck, it doesn't have that many crazy bombs. It's mostly just playing some big creatures and some good cards, right? And you can make that work pretty well in sealed too. So first you look at that, and don't worry this is just some sort of small guide to get you started. If you're new to sealed, you want to play the open, you want to do well, this is for you. I will talk more about how to figure out what the best control deck is for you, but again, if you just want to set rule for what to look at 5-color green, see if you can make that work. Look at blue control with card draw and tempo, and look at your fatties. And then figure out what the best combination of those cards creates the best controlling and greedy deck, right? But I want to note that you do not want to overlook aggro decks. Up to this point, I've talked a lot about... I didn't show you this deck either. We're going to talk more about this deck later, but this is another controlling deck that like, this is the base blue deck, this is the base green fatties deck, this is the base blue card draw control deck, and then this is the 5-color green deck, right? These are all just reasonable examples of sealed decks that I can't think of the word, but that show the strategies that I'm talking about. And then you don't want to overlook aggro, because contrary to my impressions on draft, I think sealed is too slow right now. I think that the metagame has people being too greedy with their decks, surprisingly. I think it's still a slow format. Like, if everyone was playing optimally, it would be a very slow format. But I think people have gone a little bit too much to the other extreme and are underrating aggro decks. So my second step is to look at your aggro deck. Try and figure out what aggro deck you can build the best. And again, we will talk more about how you go about doing that a little bit later. But just look at your combat tricks. If you want to set some set steps, you look at your combat tricks, you look at your removal spells, you look at your cheap creatures and your curves, and how you're going to kill your opponent. And then you try and build the best aggro deck out of that you can. And then, I'm sure you can guess step 3 by now, you want to compare your aggro and your control deck, right? Ideally, at this point, I'm not sure about the Arena Open because we haven't had a competitive sealed event before, but on Magic Online, you have a 20-minute timer to build your pool. So at this point, hopefully you'll still have, when you're starting to compare, you'll have 10 to 8 minutes left. And at the end of all that, you should have at least 5 minutes left, and you'll have figured out what general archetype that you are going to play. And then step 4, this is the last one, I promise, I like to fine-tune my deck with a bunch of other options. I like to look at all the cards in my sideboard, which I didn't show you sideboards here because it would be too hard to see the main decks. You get to look at all your current cards, look at your mana base, look at your land count, and try to decide how to optimally make it efficient. And this is not something that you can pick up as easily because it requires a lot of experience playing sealed to understand how decks work and what you will need to change. But you should at the very least spend this time considering other card choices, thinking about how they will impact your deck, thinking about how they will impact your gameplay, and then choosing what to do. For reference, this deck is from my friend Logan Martz. He won a PTQ with this sealed deck. He top 8'd with this deck, and then he won the draft qualifying for the PT. And he then gave me a shout out about my article. So you can, I guess I could put that in the clickbait title too. PTQ winner endorsed or whatever. But he was very smart, and he built his deck very well. And despite playing against a lot of greedy decks with a lot better bombs, all he really has is Battle Mammoth, he crushed them. He even had the option to play a greedy deck because he showed me his pool afterwards and the initial build he was considering until he eventually switched at the last minute. And it had like these Cardors and these Demon Bolts, and it just had a really greedy mana base that he didn't need to play because his deck was so powerful as it is. And it's much better at running over people who are trying to be greedier than him. And I think the reason that you're able to, or that I am able to make a strategy like this, one that is so easily comprehensible and set into steps, is because this format, because this sealed format, Kaldheim, the sealed format of Kaldheim does not support mid-range decks. I do not think you want to be playing a mid-range deck in Kaldheim. I think you want to be on one of the ends of the aggressive or controlling spectrum and stick to it. Because of how Foretell impacts the format, the control decks beat the mid-range decks very easily because, again, they don't have to play curve pieces. What is a mid-range deck? Like, the essence of a mid-range deck is the middle point between aggro and control. You're playing curve pieces so that you have the option to kill your opponent, but you're also playing control decks. And in reality, what ends up happening, especially in this set, is that you just don't do either very well. You still lose the aggressive decks occasionally. You might be a little stronger than the control decks, and you very often lose the control decks because they're already trying to beat the aggro decks, and then they're just playing against you, who's much slower, so you'll have a harder time going under them. And they also just have the late game because of their Foretell cards, giving them card advantage by not playing 2-drops. Their bombs they get to play more of because they're splashing, so on and so forth. And this makes my strategy more effective because normally you want to consider every card that could go in every deck, right? You don't just want to lock yourself into an archetype and say, this is what I'm playing. I didn't even consider this. You want to consider everything. And normally there's a lot more things to consider because, like I said, every card can go in every deck. Mammoth Growth could go in your mid-range deck or your aggro deck, occasionally even a control deck, who knows. To Scary Firewalker, Zorof's Pac-Mate, well, that goes in every deck. But you know what I mean. Like, these cards, you don't know where these cards want to go. But it gets a lot easier when you partition them into aggro decks and control decks and then try and build the best two. It also is much faster, which, again, may or may not matter for Arena, but if you're a Magic Online player and you like playing PTQs, it's much faster, which allows you to gain extra time for making the minute card choices to improve your equity, right? And then on a related note, if you're a Magic Online player, I originally wrote this video for Magic Online. It just happened that I was very lucky that the Arena PTQ was announced a day afterwards, and the day before I was recording. But on a related topic, if you are a Magic Online player, feel free to skip ahead if you're not, do not waste your time. I've seen so many people on stream, on drafts they've been showing me, waste time on their picks or on their building. You get 20 minutes, and they submit with 8 minutes left on the clock. Do not do this, especially in a PTQ. After 9 rounds, a single card choice that you make wrong could have a very large impact on your win rate and how many wins you get in the tournament. So even if you're just making 100% sure that your mana base is built correctly, making 100% sure that you want to play 17 lands as opposed to 16 or 18 or whatever, making 100% sure that your curve is good and you can't replace a curve piece or that you're not sideboarding a card that you shouldn't be, you should take the time to make sure you are doing that. And if you're on Arena and you watched this far and you want to be better at the Arena Open, don't submit too early. There's no time limit, but that doesn't mean you should submit too fast because you'll be losing a lot of equity and it'll be a lot harder to win. All right, and I already talked about this a little bit, but I just want to give a disclaimer. There are competitive people very competitive people who watch me, and those people might say, I don't like this simplified version. That's fair enough. It is what I said it is. It's a simplified version meant for people who are new to Sealed and want some sort of comprehensive guide to Arena. Keep watching. I will get to the more complex stuff of how to actually build your deck and what is better in Sealed than others. The main issue is that I've seen people get quote unquote lost in the sauce and end up having a weird mid-range pile that doesn't work in the format, having an unoptimized build because they wasted too much time, or not considering enough archetypes and then just missing something completely. I had an opponent in a PTQ I play. Game 1, their deck was just not good. It was this green-white creature deck, and I crushed them. And then Game 2, they sideboarded into this insane deck with 4 board wipes, and I just got destroyed because I wasn't prepared for that. And that's not to say that what they did was correct, but it's to say that it's very easy to overlook an archetype. So you want to make sure that you're not wasting your time. And it's even more easy to fall into all these traps I just talked about in Kaldheim because the format is so complex. All the cards are playable, and how do I put this? There's lots of playables, and every card is pretty flexible. So it's really hard to discern if you're just looking at your pool. If you can easily get lost if you just look at your pool and say, what the hell do I do with this pool? I don't know what to do. So you gotta, especially if you're new, but even if you're not, like my first sealed pool with Kaldheim, I was lost. I'll be honest, I was lost. I was streaming it, and I spent the first 20 minutes just talking to myself, trying to figure out how the hell I should play this. I looked at a total of like 7 different archetypes, I think. 7 different color combinations on archetypes where I finally settled on the one I thought was correct. So if you're new to sealed in general, let alone new to sealed in Kaldheim, you need to make sure you don't get lost because it's very easy to. And that's why I think, even though it might not be completely ideal, partitioning into aggro control decks and then looking at the 2 between them is actually a good idea. All right. So now what I want to do is I want to move on to some general format tips and just talk about what I think is different about this format than other formats and how you should be going about building your deck in sealed. I may at some point make a video in the future about how to play sealed gameplay, but I probably won't. This is mostly about deck building. All right, so general format tips. I want to talk about blue-white flyers. Not necessarily the archetype, but the concept of a flyer. Because in different sealed formats, flyers have been better or worse. And in this format, it's actually interesting in that they're very good in multiples and not very good on their own. The issue is that a lot of people, almost everyone, has bombs, and a singular flyer does not do, a single or even 2 flyers won't necessarily beat a bomb. You need them to all kind of work together and align to create a game plan to actually kill your opponent. And then with those flyers, you also generally want some sort of tempo effect to make sure that you are not just losing to random ground creatures. I think that's all I really want to talk about. I talk about this more in depth in my article on Draft Sim, so you can check that out if you want me to talk more in depth about how I think you should best be using flyers in Kaldheim. But it's different in that you want multiples, and they're not amazing on their own. In addition, there's a good amount of removal, and people in the sealed format are playing most of their removal. So if you're relying on 1 or 2 flyers to get the job done, if you could do a board stall, you can't be relying on that. If you're just playing a bunch of fatties, expecting board stalls, and then hoping that your flyers will get the job done, that's not necessarily a good game plan. All right, I'm going to have a quick water break. Okay, next sealed tip. The Sackland cycle is broken. These cards. I'm going to go over a lot of cards. As you can see, I have a million tabs here. Also, I didn't apologize for this at first, but apologies for the bad setup. I know it's a bit bootleg, and it may be able to be better, but I already put, say, I think at the end it'll be 12. I think right now it's at like 7 or 8 hours of work into this, and I don't really feel like spending another 4 hours trying to get these to look very nice. So apologies, but this is what you're getting. Take it or leave it. Maybe in the future I'll improve it. We'll see. Anyways, the Sackland cycle are all very broken. You may not think it, but they're very good. Basically, all of them have an effect that is worth it. If you think about it, it's like it's a land, right? So it taps for mana early, at the downside of losing 1 mana when you play it because it comes in tapped. And in the late game, it's a good spell. It's not just some mediocre spell that you can turn into. Like the Cycle and Dominaria, if you remember that, they were mediocre. Like, they weren't effects that you really wanted. This is a good effect. Like, I would probably play a spell like this. I would pay 6 mana to make a 4/4 and create a green Charl. I wouldn't be happy about it, but I would put it in a decent number of my decks if I was already in red-green. Then add to that the flexibility of being a land in the early game if you need mana, and it gets a lot of equity. I like to consider these sack lands, even the worst ones are. So even the worst ones like Breadguard Stronghold are still very good effects, right? This is one of the worst ones. It's very conditional. You need 2 creatures in play. You need you need the +1/+1 counter to affect their stat lines. You need lifelink to be relevant. It doesn't always happen, right? It isn't always good. But even ones like this, it's just a green land that has very low opportunity cost and has very high upside. And I like to think of these as multicolored cards. So when you're considering whether or not you want to go into 5 colors or not, or whether you want to splash a color or not, you can consider these almost multicolored cards. You can consider them like half a multicolored bomb, right? And they do provide you a surprising amount of equity. If you haven't played with them already, I would recommend it. If you haven't played with them and you don't believe how powerful they are, you should try them, because you'll be very surprised by how much equity you'll gain. And again, the opportunity cost is you have a tap land. And I want to reiterate, because I've seen people not doing this, even if you are not on color for them or only splashing for them, you should still play them, especially if you have 5 color fixtures. Look at this deck in particular, right? My base colors are very, very clearly black and green. I'm playing like 2 red cards, 1 white card, 1 blue card, right? But I do have 2 Glittering Frost and a Rough Cleaning Ring, all of which are 5 color fixtures. And because of that, even though, again, I'm base black, black green, I'm playing a red, a black, and a blue land. All right? And the black one, I guess, kind of doesn't count because it's already a swamp, but I would probably play 1 mountain anyways, right? I need multiple mountains for these red cards. I would probably play 1 island anyways, or I guess the second island, because I already have the Snow Cover Island, because Cosmete is so good and only good early. And then the upside you gain of potentially sacking these cards in the late game is so high, right? You're paying such a low cost, and the upside is so high, especially with the 5 color fixtures. I don't even need to have more red sources. Like, I can just have the Slumber Mountain play, and then have 2 forests and a single 5 color fixture, and suddenly I can sack it. There you go. That's it. The 5 color fixture produces red. This requires red 2 green to sack, and then you pay the 2 green, and that's it. And at the cost of having maybe a tap mountain, it might mess your mana base up a little bit, but like so does splashing all these other bombs. So you can almost think of it like you're splashing a really good bomb, or a really good multicolored card. And when you're considering what colors to splash, you should consider these. All right, we talked about that a lot. Let's move on. There are a lot of overrated sagas. I talk about this in my article, so feel free to read more in depth there. But these sagas all are not great. It's tempting to think they are good, especially again if you're new to Sealed and you've played Limited in the past. Usually, multicolored cards are very good. They're archetype payoffs or just very, very overrate cards. These are not. A lot of them are. The other 4 that I don't mention here are actually very, very good. And even these 2 are like pretty good, just not amazing. But these 4, don't put these 4 cards in your deck. There are very few decks that I will put any of these 4 in. And I'll give you a little bit of logic on like these 2. These 2 are bad because they just don't do anything much of the time. They don't do anything until very late in the game. Because if you play a Scent of the Worthy before you have a creature in your graveyard, your opponent could just choose not to trade off for your creatures, and then it'll sack on after 3 turns and get nothing back. But if you wait till there's a creature in your graveyard, well, then it's kind of too late. Because you play this card, you get no immediate tempo. Next turn, no immediate tempo. And then finally, turn afterwards, you get a reanimate, which isn't even that much. Then with the 3 seasons, again, it's kind of the same thing. You want to regrowth 2 snow permanents, which isn't even that good of an effect in the first place. And if you play it early, you're pretty likely to whiff, because your opponent could just not kill your snow permanents, and you have to mill 3, just randomly hit the snow permanents, which is not that likely. But if you play it later, it's really slow, and you'd rather just have a draw 2 or whatever. And then these 2 are just bad. I'm not even going to go into it. These 2. This one's okay. This one's horrible. I'm not going to go into it. Nico Defies Destiny is okay. The main issue is that it just doesn't play out how you want to. I'm not going to go into specifics, but it just does. Like, if you play it with a Foretell card, you can theory craft it in your mind if you want, and you should hopefully soon see that if you play turn 2 Foretell card, turn 3 Nico's Destiny, it just doesn't work out very well. Like, the best case is that you gain 2 life, make 2 mana, which pays for, and you still are paid 1, you're still down 1 mana, and then you get the card back. So you're paying 1 mana to gain 2 life and draw a card. I mean, it's a regrowth kind of better than a card draw, but it's not a regrowth. Because the issue is that if you play this card before you have a Foretell, you can't play this card until you have a Foretold card that will go in your graveyard. So what if you foretell a creature, and then you play this? Well, you play the creature, and then it pops off, and you get nothing back, right? These 2, again, I'm not going to go into. They're just kind of mediocre. They're still very good cards, but I wouldn't necessarily look to splash them, and they both require your deck to be very specific for them to be good. Finally, general format tips. I think that having a couple removal spells is much more important than it has been in previous formats. And even it is in draft. Because in this sealed format, there's so many bombs, but also all of those bombs are creatures, right? So, and usually those creatures are like above rate creatures that you feel like you need to answer or you'll get tempoed out, or they're creatures with a recurring card advantage effect that you'll lose to eventually. So because there's a lot of bombs, because it's sealed and you get 6 rares, and because most of those bombs are creatures, having removal to answer them is really, really important. Also, having removal to answer flyers is important if you're playing a control deck, because usually control decks try to leverage ground creature tempo to not die to aggro, as opposed to playing flyers or removal necessarily. So having a couple removal spells is important. And if you're trying to play a control deck without removal, you're going to have a bad time a lot of the time. You may think that your deck's good, and it may be in draft, but when everybody else gets to play bombs, pretty much guaranteed unless they just open 0, and you don't have removal or a bomb of your own, and you're not trying to kill your opponent early with an aggressive strategy, it's just not going to go well for you. So you need to make sure that you're having removal or that you have a game plan to beat bombs of some sort. Okay, I think those are some good general format tips. I'm open to more questions. Obviously, this was I tried to make it as concise as possible, and there's probably more I could talk about, but we're already 25 minutes in, and I want to get into the color rankings. So let's just move on. Questions always welcome. So just a quick color rankings. I think blue and green are the best colors by a lot. I talked about this before, but the main reason is that the snow cards are just above rate, and these are the main two colors with snow cards. And then again, because the format's snow, like we already established, or slow, excuse me, not snow, because the format is slow, foretell cards that provide tempo get a lot better. And blue and green have the best foretell cards, like Scarf's Packmate and Behold the Multiverse, and other cards that provide good tempo and make your control decks a lot better. I feel like I lost my train of thought here, but whatever, we'll just move on. And then the other thing is that, again, because the format is slow, and these are already slower colors, they benefit. Like, blue is known for card draw, green is known for big creatures. And big creatures actually work pretty well as a win con in the format, and card draw is obviously very good in control decks, especially paired with removal, which you'll be more likely to have because you're a sealed deck with access to more removal. Right? Other good cards, I'm just, like, these are just the best commons in the set for sealed, or close to it. Packmate especially is very easy, and then the Lindworm, I think, is not the best in the set, probably not even the second, but maybe like the fourth, but I think it's a little underrated, and you should not underrate this card. Similar with Berkstrider, not amazing, but a very, very good card, and slightly underrated, especially in sealed. So, and then with these colors, so now I've said, okay, I've hopefully proven to you why I think these are the best colors. What do you want to do with them? Usually, you want to figure out how to leverage them to create your control deck. Typically, we'll talk about this more later, typically when I'm looking at which control deck I want to compare to my aggro deck, I try and build a base blue or base green deck, and then figure out what I can use to supplement those colors. I think green might be slightly better in sealed because it has a lot more playables and a lot more potential to be aggressive, meaning that it's more flexible in where you can play it, as evidenced by all the decks I've shown are basically all green, even the aggro deck's green. I guess this one's blue-white, but 3 out of 4 decks, still a good amount, very flexible. And then typically with blue, you want to figure out how to leverage the card advantage and tempo you have to complement your other cards. I don't feel like that's very specific, but we'll get into more specifics later. Let me just check my notes and make sure I'm not missing anything here. Okay, I think this is a better way to put it that I wrote out earlier. Typically, you want to figure out how to be as greedy as possible with blue, trying to exploit its most powerful commons to win late games. Yes, that is a much better way to put it than I put it. Cards like Berkstrider and just Behold the Multiverse are so powerful in the late game, right? And Berkstrider is also very good if you're behind because it saves you a lot of life and provides a 4/4, which is a very good stat line in the format. Whereas with green, you can just use it with basically whatever. Blue, you have to make sure that you're looking at it in the right context. It's very hard to build an aggressive deck with blue, but bear in mind, very possible with the correct tempo cards. Yeah, okay, so let's move on to red. Red is a little less flexible, but I think it's very clearly the third best color because its cards are just the most powerful, right? I think black and white do not have very good powerful commons. But actually, let's take a quick water break. Hold on. Okay, we're back. So yeah, red is less flexible, and it's much more reliant on the premium commons because the differential between the premium commons and the less premium commons are pretty high. But with the premium commons, they are super powerful, especially in the context of this format and in the context of Kaldheim Sealed. Cards like Tiscari Firewalker and Demon Bolt are both so amazing in either aggressive or slower decks. Especially the Demon Bolt, it's a premium removal spell, and it's a foretell card, and it provides tempo. This is one of the best cards in the set. It's not quite as good as I believe Behold the Multiverse is, but it's pretty close. That might be the second. There's not a ton of point to ranking what the best cards are, but what I mean to say is that the powerful commons are very powerful, and if you get the right commons, red is a very nice color to be playing. You can also pair it very well with green and blue decks to make some sort of green-red fatties deck that I found works better in sealed than in draft, and lets you use your combat tricks in both red and green as best you can. And you can use it in blue because there's some good synergy between some of the removal spells and some of the uncommons and multicolored cards. And blue typically lacks hard removal, and red provides that sometimes. And we'll talk about this more later again as we get. I'm basically trying to make it as it's either a reverse or it's either an inverse or a normal pyramid. I'm having a hard time describing which, but I'm starting with the most broad knowledge and then honing in on the specifics. Essentially, I'm starting with the general format tips, and then we move on to. Or I'm starting with how to build your sealed deck, then we're moving on general format tips, then we're moving on to color rankings, and then after this we'll get into specific cards and the specifics of building your deck. Next color I think is black. This is actually different from my article. I think in draft, black is the worst color, and it's not close, but in sealed, a lot of the cards get a lot better. And the reason for that is that a lot of black's cards are just not great rate. They're kind of clunky, and they're just they're mid-rangey in a sense. And in draft, you don't want clunky mid-rangey cards. You want a very fine-tuned, honed deck that has a game plan. And black does not provide you with very many game plans. What black does give you, which is good and sealed, is some nice 2-for-1s, like Skull Raid, some nice removal like Feed the Serpent at common, that also exiles, which is somewhat relevant in the format, and some mid-rangey creatures that are very flexible, both in the early game and the late game. Cards like, I don't have it pulled up right now, but I guess I can find it, Grim Draugr. The 3-mana 3-2 that you could pay a 1 and a snow, a colorless and a snow, to give +1/+0 and menace. Not a good card in draft, too inefficient. In sealed, though, pretty good card. Trades off in their early game against aggro decks. Late game, you can pump it and give it menace, and it's really annoying for your opponent to answer. I don't love the card, and I still don't think black's great, but it's better than it is in draft, and it has a place in sealed. And then finally, I just don't think white's good in sealed. It has a similar issue to what black does in draft, in that you can use the cards well if you get enough of them. Like, the cards are good in a critical mass because they all kind of work well together. Like, there's a 2/3 that taps creatures. There's cheap removal, like Bound in Gold. There's some nice combat tricks. There's spells that benefit from playing 2 spells a turn. But all of these cards require other cards to be at their best. And in general, you just won't get the right support to play a white deck in sealed. And even if you do get the right deck, it's still just not as powerful as blue or green. So, like, the times that you go in white are when you get a lot of bombs, or when your pool is dog shit, and, keyword and, you still might not want to play white. If your pool is dog shit and your white cards all work together well enough and you have enough of them, which is not a common thing. Alright, apologies for the jump cut. I got cut off. Apparently my audio stopped working halfway through in my last recording, and I wasted about half an hour talking. But it is what it is. We're going to jump back in where we left off. We were talking about why white is dog shit, if I remember correctly, from the recording. I think I'm just going to end it there. White's dog shit unless you can get the critical mass of commons that you need, and the rest of your pool is not very good. And then we'll just move on, because I'm going to have a hard time entering my train of thought and my stream of consciousness unless I just move on and don't jump in the middle, okay? So after that, I want to talk about the specifics of control deck building. We're going to get more specific and move into that. Okay, so first of all, just to reiterate, we talked about it earlier, but you should be playing basically every on-color sackland that you get, and you should be considering them, you should be thinking of them as cards that you want to splash, as cards that make your splash better without a lot of downside. So if you're considering what colors to splash and why, you should count these and make sure you're aware of them. And then the other thing I wanted to reiterate is that you need to have some sort of game plan against aggro. I preach greed a lot in this video up to this point, but what I actually mean, and perhaps I don't communicate well, is that it's easier to be greedy and that you won't get punished as hard inherently. But if you just cut all your 2-drops and play like 4 foretell cards and hope they carry you, you're still going to get run over a lot of the time. And even if you don't get run over, you might want to kill your opponent, but you can't because you're so focused on winning the late game, right? And then you might just lose to a bomb that you can't kill because you can't race it either, if that makes sense. So it's still important to make sure that you're having curve pieces, like in this deck. Even with 3 to 4 good foretell cards that provide tempo, I'm still playing a good 4 2-drops because A, I feel like I need them against aggro, and B, because they do something in the late game, right? It's obviously easier if you have good 2-drops to do things in the late game, but even if you don't, and even if it feels horrible, sometimes you just gotta take the loss and play an Axe Scout Cavalry in your non-aggressive deck, like in this deck. Again, decent amount of foretell cards, but I didn't feel like losing to aggro, and I did think that this would help me in some matchups, even where my opponent was not aggressive, and I played it over the 3rd Aggro or the 3rd Graven Hulk. So make sure you're not getting too greedy. And then lastly, I wanted to make sure people know, don't be afraid to splash foretell cards. Oh, I guess we can talk about greed a little bit more in this one too, right? Like, I easily could have been much more greedy in this deck with 2 board wipes, but I felt like if I wasn't drawing the board wipes, I still wanted to have a chance of winning the game. And it's not like I'm adding cards that also help me with the Doomscars, right? Like cards like Mistwalker. I don't have to play this card. This deck could easily cut Mistwalker or Stararm Coaster. I don't need a 2/2 flyer for 3. I don't need a 1/4 flyer for 3 with a pump ability. Especially with these board wipes. I could have gone full ham and winning the late game and played some more controlling cards. But these are okay after Doomscar. I don't mind playing them before to threaten a racing scenario. And if I don't draw Doomscar, having these curve pieces is really important, especially because Behold the Multiverse is not a foretell card that provides tempo when you cast it. Right? And then the last thing I want to talk about in control. I think controlling decks they're harder to explain how to build, right? Like, I'm giving you specific tips, but you still need to know what you're doing in the sense of can you arrive at the conclusion that this is the correct build to play? Because it's not super easy. It looks very good once you see it, but arriving at the conclusion that you're supposed to be playing base green with enough black to have the coup drops and the removal spells, and you're supposed to splash all these other colored cards isn't necessarily easy to spot. Unfortunately, it's not super easy for. It's also not easy for me to explain how you're supposed to notice that. But just be in the lookout for all archetypes, right? Try not to overlook things. If that makes sense. And then lastly, the last concrete tip. Again, I wish I could give more. I will give more concrete tips on aggro, but because I think it's a lot easier to explain. But the last thing that I guess you can focus on is don't be afraid to splash for tail cards, especially cards like Skull Raid and Demon Bolt. I talk about why Foretell cards are good, and that they're good because they let you replace curve pieces. Those Foretell cards do not let you replace curve pieces, right? Because you can't guarantee early that you're able to turn them into tempo because you don't have the color. But they still have a good amount of equity in that if you don't have their color, you can put mana into them for later in the game. So a scenario I used earlier before the recording got cut off was foretelling Demon Bolt on turn 2 because you didn't have a 2-drop, and then on turn 5 or 6, once you finally draw your red source, you play it plus a 5-drop. Whereas if you just had no 2-drop to play on turn 2, and Demon Bolt was some bounded gold type removal spell, just a 3-mana removal, generic removal spell, it would be a lot worse. You wouldn't be able to double spell, and you also wouldn't be able to cast it early because you didn't have the white stars until turn 5. So it still does get a decent amount of value from having foretell cards, and I do still like splashing foretell cards more than I like splashing non-foretell cards. So don't be too afraid of that. All right, and then I wanted to move on to talking about how to build your aggro decks. I think this is much more interesting and much more straightforward, at least in terms of how to explain it. First of all, combat tricks are good. They are very, very good in aggro decks, especially in Kaldheim and especially in Sealed. Secondly, if you're going to play an aggro deck, you need to make sure you're having either combat tricks or removal spells, because if you don't, you're going to get bombed out. And you can't replace your removal spells with your combat tricks. So oftentimes, if I open a good control deck that does not have enough removal that I feel will support it, I will try to play a more aggressive deck with combat tricks, because if your opponent plays some sort of creature bomb, and they don't block, they're probably just going to die, right? You have like +4 damage off the Mammoth Growth, and your also creatures aren't getting blocked because they're afraid of their creature dying. And then if they do block, well, then you exchange you play your combat trick, their creature dies, yours doesn't, and then you basically exchange your combat trick for their creature, which is the point of a removal spell, right? You are losing some damage, notably. Run Amok doesn't let you lose damage, so that's nice, but you are losing some damage. So if you're... Damn, I lost my train of thought. I was really in the zone, and then my recording got cut off. I'm still probably kind of pissed because I've lost my train of thought. But hopefully what I'm saying is making sense. Combat tricks are good. Play them in your aggro decks and make sure. Oh, I remember what I was saying. Yeah, and then the other nice thing about combat tricks is that the main times that they're bad is if you get 2-for-1, right? Is if your opponent plays a removal spell in response to your combat trick and 2-for-1s you. But in this format, with so many bombs, like in this deck, like if you use the Battle Mammoth or the Carters that they don't want to die, or the Tuskeri Firewalkers are kind of bombs because you don't want them to die, because if they attack and get value, that's good. Or Jorn, if they spend a removal spell on your combat trick, obviously it's a bad exchange for you, and you prefer it not happen, and if you knew they had it, you wouldn't have played the combat trick. But it's not as bad as it might normally be, because removal is very limited and very spread thin in this format, and you don't get access to that much of it, which means that if they're using it on your combat tricks to 2-for-1 your bomb might be living and murdering your opponent, which is good, right? The other main thing is that big creatures are good, and that's kind of for a similar reason to the removal. Again, if they want to spend removal on your big creatures, well, that means you're not spending removal on your bombs. That's good. And then in addition, the cards that I'm talking about, like Craven Hook, 4-mana 4/4 can't block alone, or Grizzly Outrider, 5-mana 5/5, the stat lines are just really good. It's strange how it plays out, but it plays out almost like a core set if you're familiar with core set Sealed, or core set Limited in general. Which is a surprising conclusion, given that it's such a complex set in every other aspect. Its draft format's complex, its sealed building is complex, the control decks are so versatile, and there's so many different ways to build them, but the aggro decks, you kind of just jam some creatures and combat tricks in your deck and hope it works out. And this is kind of evidenced by this deck. Like, this does not look like a Kaldheim deck that pops off. It's just some creatures, some combat tricks, like there's foretell cards, but still, there's some creatures and combat tricks and a couple removal spells, and that's about all. That's about it. You're splashing a couple good cards. Like, this is a generic Sealed deck, except you're just replacing the M20 cards with Kaldheim cards. So big creatures are a lot better than they look and line up well against the format. And then the other card type that I think is a little underrated and you can use to replace combat tricks is equipment. I've been surprised by how good the equipments have been, in particular the Tormentor's Helm, and the Cold Vein Pick. I think Helm's good in both draft and Sealed. Pick is only good in Sealed, but it's surprising how good these are. +1/+1 has been a surprisingly good way to push through creatures. The extra mana and fixing for splashing off this has been surprisingly relevant. And you often get into late games where creature combat is still relevant. You don't just get board stalled out, but your creatures are trading, and giving them +1/+1 accumulates a good amount of value over the course of the game, if that makes sense. So equipments are surprisingly good, and again, because of the whole removal thing, you risk a lot less of them killing your creatures in response to or after you equip to waste mana, because again, if they're spending removal, then they're not spending any of your bombs. And again, because the big creatures line up so well against the format, the 4/4s and the 5/5s, turning your 3/4 or a 3/2 into a 4/3 can often push it through when it normally wouldn't otherwise. So cards like Scary Firewalker, if you make it into a 4/3, you'll often get an extra attack with it before your opponent kills it. And that's an extra attack is worth +1 card, which replaces the equipment that you then had to play, right? Which is a good deal. However, I want to add a cautionary tale. In this deck specifically, what I think he did wrong was that he went too ham on all of the combat tricks and non-creature inconsistent cards. Between the 4 combat tricks, the 3 growths and the run amok, I guess not the Demon Bolts, but the inconsistent cards like Littjara Glade Warden, the Carters, which are only good if you have the correct mana for them, and the 3/5 drops, I think he would run into a lot of issues where he didn't draw a creature, or didn't draw enough creatures to leverage his other cards. Because the thing about combat tricks and these other inconsistent cards is that if you draw too many of them, it's really bad, and your opponent can play around it pretty easily. Like, let's say you actually have a creature, like even one creature. Let's say you have a Breakneck Berserker. Your opponent can just not block it, and then you can't use mana on the Mammoth Growth. You can't use mana on your creatures because they're either too expensive and you don't have enough lands, or because they're off color, and you're just kind of sitting there, for lack of better words, with your dick in your hand, not really sure what to do. And this happens a surprising amount if you don't build with this in mind. You have to remember that you're still playing an aggressive deck, and that you still need curve pieces and a high enough creature count to make all those other card types work. So don't go too ham. These are more. I'm having a hard time phrasing this. All of the card types that I just talked about that I think are a little underrated and that you should make sure you're putting in your decks are supplementary cards. In the end, your base is still your curve, your bombs, your good rate creatures. And then you get to choose how to best make those work with the equipment, combat tricks, and big creatures. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. And then lastly and finally, you can still splash. I don't have a picture of this, unfortunately, but my opponent or my friend... Jeez, I cannot speak. I'm getting very tired. That's what happens. I've been talking for an hour straight, and then it turns out the last half of the recording got cut off, so now I had to talk for another half an hour or whatever. But you can splash. My opponent built... Please, end my suffering. My friend built their sealed deck very incorrectly, in my opinion. They said it was very bad, and they did not have a lot of removal. So they played red-white aggro, and were just kind of sad. But they just had an Essica's Chariot. For those of you who don't know what that card does, it's very broken. I'll pull it up. I forgot to pull it up ahead of time, but that's fine. An Essica's Chariot, and a red-green land in their sideboard. And I'm just like, I get you don't want to be greedy, and you're playing an aggro deck, but this card is so broken. This card is so insanely broken, and you're not paying that much equity by splashing it with a free tap land. So make sure you still consider splashing in your aggro deck, because cards like this one's obviously extremely broken, but even just okay bombs are oftentimes worth splashing in your aggro decks, and you don't lose that much equity by being down a card or by potentially not having the ability to cast the card, because the aggro decks, like with all the things I just talked about, the big creatures and the combat tricks, it's pretty easy to make it to the late game and still win with your aggro decks, especially if you get early damage in. And he does that very well. My friend who won the PTQ does that very well with their Carter splash. Like, this looks like a weird splash, right? You're splashing these. This is actually a perfect example of the sack lands too. You're splashing 2 sack lands, which are very hard to sack because they need themselves and an extra swamp and 2 mountains, and splashing the Carter in a deck that doesn't necessarily look like it needs it, but because he felt like he had enough creatures. I think he was a little light on the creatures, but that could have been fixed more easily by cutting other cards as opposed to the Carters. You could have cut like the Littjara Glade Warden and the Breakneck Berserker and maybe one of the combat tricks, right? But because he felt like he didn't actually, but because he felt like he had enough creatures, which you can if you build correctly, he was able to splash these cards without losing too much consistency. And the upside of cards like Carter is just so high. So don't be afraid to splash in your aggro decks. Okay, and then I was actually going to do a over and underrated cards review section where I go over a bunch of cards and talk about which ones I think are under and overrated and why. However, my throat is already absolutely murdering me, and I just don't feel like doing that. So I'm going to go through them and talk about them really quickly, but I'm not going to go super in depth. Okay, the first one is Run Ashore. This one I'll go into depth because I'm so absurdly high on this card, especially compared to everyone else. I've gotten so many responses. Like, I post about it on Twitter all the time. Stop passing this card. And everyone, or not everyone, but a decent, people go out of their way to comment on Twitter telling me I am wrong, this card sucks. And I just don't get it. Like, have you played with the card? All right, so now let's go through some logic on why this card is so good. Right? So, the worst case. Let's talk about the worst case scenario, basically. I mean, obviously, the actual worst case scenario is you can't cast it, but that's true of any card. The worst case scenario is that you cast it, and your opponent has, like, what? Let's say 2 3-drops. They have 2 generic 3-drops. I've gone through the example before, and I'll go through it again. If they have 2 3-mana 3/3s. You put one in their hand, and one on top of their library. If they choose to put it on the bottom of their library, well, that's probably good for you. You just got a free removal spell, right? You killed their creature and bounced a 3-drop. That's a good for 6 mana. And if they put it on top of their library, then they have to waste a draw step to redraw it, and then spend 6 mana to play both of their 3-drops. And in that exchange, you're net 0 mana, because you paid 6 mana, they paid 6. You're net 0 cards, because they had to waste a draw step, and you went down a card. And you're just like that's the worst case as a card. And then there's so much upside. There's so many scenarios where you can get upside. If your opponent has a combo trick, you blow them out. If your opponent has a removal spell on your own creature, you can bounce it. If your opponent has expensive creatures or expensive permanents, it bounces any non-land permanent. They have expensive permanents, you get a bunch of tempo out of it. Again, without losing card advantage. If they have tokens, you get to kill the tokens for free. If you have sagas of your own, you can bounce your own sagas with the 3rd trigger on the stack. There's so much value to be out of this card, and people just pass it very late and don't put it in their sealed decks. Don't pass it late. Put it in your sealed decks. Please, trust me. All right, next up we have Run Ashore. This was a joke that I am not delivering well because I'm too tired to do it. But next up we have Run Ashore. Haha, yeah, card's great. All right, seriously though, card's great. Stop passing it. Put it in your deck. It's busted. All right, onto the real cards. Raiders Carve, very good card. Easy to crew. 4/4 is very good, and the anti-flood capability is very high. I would go into more detail, but I just don't have the energy in me. I said Troll. Especially good in sealed. I think it's already underrated in draft, but it's especially underrated in sealed because the Indestructible is so much better in the late game. Like, this card will just win you a late game all on its own. Like, having 2 of this card in your deck is a game plan to win the late game. I talked earlier about how you need a game plan to win the late game. This card is the game plan. Again, the worst case is a 3-mana 2/3. And the upside is it's an indestructible creature in the late game, or you can leave 2 snowmen up and your opponent can't really attack into it. And that's just so much equity. It's so much equity for one card with such a little downside. Do not underrate this card. It is a mythic common, to say. Next up, Run Amok. I think people are probably rating this correctly because I think everyone's been high on it now, but I'm with them and that it's a very, very good card. It doesn't look it, but again, you need Common to push through. The trample means that you get punished for them blocking because you still get some trample damage in. 2 mana is the good stat line, is much better than 3 mana. And +3/+3 is the perfect amount of stats. It's just a good card that works out well. We talked about it earlier, but Mammoth Throw is pretty good. Just good combat trick that you'll play. You could foretell earlier and get some tempo later. Good card. Frostbite. I actually don't think this card's as good in limited as other people, in draft as other people think it is, but I think it's actually better in sealed than people think it is. I love splashing this card in my 5-color decks because it's very easy to double spell with it on the later points of the game. It's much harder in draft because your decks are so consistent, but with this card, if you have it early, you're obviously very happy because Shock's already a good card, and it's better than Shock because it can deal 3 damage. And then if you have it later, you'll typically have 3 Snowlands, and then it'll be very good. So make sure to consider this for splashing if you're considering splashing red, or just playing base red. Next up, Master Scald. This one is actually particularly underrated. People just don't put this card in their deck. I don't know why. Like, I will actively go out of my way to splash for this card. If I have good sagas, it can be very, very good. And there's also a decent amount of auras that aren't bad and that naturally get killed. Like Bound in Gold, there's a lot of ways to bounce creatures or kill auras or enchantments. So if you're playing, like, you don't want to put this card in your deck just because you have Bound in Gold or the -3 -0 aura. But if you have those, this card gets even more equity in that even if you don't draw one of your sagas, you still might be able to get some value out of it. Next up, Iron Verdict. I don't know why I put this on here. I think it's probably properly rated. People know this card's good, but it's better in sealed than draft because the games play out so much more mid-rangey and so much more clunkily, so that oftentimes your opponent has to attack, or you can play in a way that forces them to attack, and that way you'll get value. You'll get value out of this more than you will in a non-aggro deck or in a draft deck. Saw it coming. Counterspells are already very good in sealed, especially in this format with a lot of bombs. And then this card is in particular good because it's a single blue counterspell and it's a foretold card. It's a foretell card, which means you can put mana into it early and then realize that tempo later. Next up, Avalanche Rider. I don't know why people aren't in love with this card. It's insanely broken. You just put it in your deck, and it's a 1/3 worst case for 2 mana, which isn't amazing, but not horrible. And then late game, oftentimes, it's just like 9 points worth of power, and the downside isn't even there because you're mana flooded because it's sealed. Like, games go late, and this card just absolutely murders people. Frostbite Yeti. I'm not a fan of this card in draft, but I'm a big fan of it in sealed. 3/3 stat line isn't great, but it's kind of similar to a flyer in that it's unblockable. I don't think it's a great card. I would prefer a 3/2 flyer for 3, or obviously a 3/3 flyer for 4. Excuse me, I would prefer a 3/2 flyer for 4. But it's passable, it blocks okay, and the ability is pretty nice in the late game. and I'm okay with it, whereas in draft I am not at all. Story Seeker. Wait, now we're moving on to the overrated cards. Story Seeker is very, very overrated. 2-drops aren't that good because of Foretell, and Aggro mirrors aren't that common, so lifelink is not as relevant as it would be normally. Frostlogger, card's bad. I don't know what to say. Like, you just don't, like, in sealed, you just don't have, even draft is not very good, but in sealed, you just don't have that many snow permanents because you get a maximum of 6 snow lands because you get 1 out of each pack. So, like, this card's just you never have enough snow lands to make this card good. Except with Zara Glidewardens, my friend Logan put it in his deck. I don't know why. It's a 4-mana 3/3. If you're getting to the late game, you should be able to do better things than this. It requires you to tap it. It requires you to have a creature in your graveyard. It requires you to pay 4 mana for a 3/3 at some point in the game. It's just not a good card. Except we have Depart the Realm. I don't know why people like this card. Bad spells aren't that good, and this is not a very good one. If the Foretell made it free, then sure, but it's also just like negative mana to Foretell, which is a horrible deal. Except Disdainful Stroke. I want to talk about Stroke specifically because in normal sealed formats, this is a very, very good card because, again, the games play out so clunkily, and your opponent is very likely to play a 4-drop that you want to counter, and will get a decent amount of value by countering it. The issue is in this format, you never waste mana. With Foretell and all the card advantage and mana sinks, it's very rare that you end up wasting mana until the late game. And in the late game, it's not very good anymore because your opponent isn't playing spells every turn. They're also in top deck mode. And in the early game, you never want to waste 2 mana leaving this up because if they don't play a 4-drop, you get mega punished. And if you don't play, and if you leave 2 mana up, you are wasting 2 mana because you could have just foretold a card or cast a foretold card, right? Finally, this one's particularly underrated. I think the gold match or overrated. I think the gold match champion is not as good as it looks. It's good in multiples and it's good with other creatures, but the way it's played out with for and against me has been surprisingly bad. I thought it was going to be very good, but again, with how often and how easy it is to use your mana, paying 2 mana to tap a creature is not great. The 2/3 stat line isn't working, and white does not do a good job at putting a lot of power in play early. It would be a lot better if white had a lot of high power, low toughness creatures, but it doesn't. It has like a lot of awkward mid-range creatures that just don't quite work with this card as much as you'd like. Like, it's still fine. It's still a 2-mana, 3-mana 2/3, but like I wouldn't go out of my way to play this card. I don't think it's a premium common like some people think it is. Okay, I'm finally done. My throat is sore. I apologize if my words were slurring near the ends there, but you gotta do what you gotta do. Outro time. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Check out my Twitter and my Twitch. Link probably in the description. Check out my article. Check out my stream. Wait, I just said that with Twitch. Is that it? That's it. I'm tired. I can't think anymore. I just can't think straight. Okay, good night. Goodbye. Merry Christmas. Happy Hanukkah.